Okay, so let's do a short linguistic survey of Asia. We're going to look at the Philippines, Tibet and Sichuan, and Guangzhou. So let's go ahead and start with the Philippines. So the Philippines was officially EMI, an English medium of instruction place. What this actually means in practice, it's not always black and white. It's a lot like Hong Kong. My wife teaches an official EMI school. What it means there and what it means in the Philippines is that the textbooks are all in English, but the classes are often in Tagalog or whatever the local languages are. Yeah. Don't look at these as being black and white in practice. Most of the country has a fairly good grasp of English. All middle class and above are fluent. I've really never hit a situation in all my travels in the Philippines where people didn't speak English. Um, One of my favorite stories is during my PhD research, I wanted to take a break, and there were these mountains on the horizon. And I took a jeep out to the mountains, and I jumped off in a rice field, and I walked about a kilometer trying to find a river. And then a farmer came out and says, "Hello, sir. Can I help you find what you're looking for?" Yeah. English is very, very common. But the Philippines recently switched to a policy of mother tongue medium of instruction. Curiously, this has been met with a lot of local resistance. People don't like this. They want to continue it being in English. Um, all the textbooks are already written in English. So to do it to the mother tongues, that requires reproducing and translating all these textbooks. I saw a presentation at the Comparative Education Society of Hong Kong a few years ago where in Cebu they declared that English was their mother tongue. This is because many of the Visayans are the people from the central Philippines, they speak English at almost the same level of proficiency as Tagalog, and they're known around the country for speaking very, very good English. Um, so it's interesting that this is supposed to be a policy that produces equity and respects local culture, but people reject it. And if we were having the class, I would ask to hold up your hands. Who would want to send their kids to a Cantonese medium school versus an English medium school? English carries a certain prestige, right? I would stop here just to make a general point that it's well understood in the education literature that teaching in a foreign medium of instruction, it helps people with that language, but it doesn't help with the subject. If you're trying to learn math and math is being taught in English, it just makes it more difficult if you don't speak English already. Let's take a look at the linguistic diversity in the Philippines. Um, there's three main language groups. There's the Philippine languages. There's the Greater Burrito languages. Don't ask me exactly what those are. I think they're actually from the indigenous people who were there before the Malay-based people came. But it comes out to a total of 175 million. Sorry, 175 languages. Um, let's look at the demographic makeup of these languages. So the Philippines is a country with about 90 million people. Only 26 million of them speak Tagalog, which is like the Putonghua of the Philippines. Only 26 million speak it as a mother tongue. Another 21 million speak Cebuano, which is another word for Visayan. Another 7.8 million speak Ilocano. Another 7 million speak a language I can't pronounce correctly. But there's a lot of languages, and this is kind of begs a question of, is it a language? Is it a dialect? Usually the threshold is mutual intelligibility. And between, I would say, you don't want to say one is the master and one is the slave, but Cebuano and Visayan is the dialects of each other. They share a lot of the same language. My wife had Cebuano roommates in college, and she picked up the language pretty quickly. Like, she can hear it fairly well. Ilocano is mutually unintelligible. Like, most people who speak Tagalog don't really understand Ilocano, right? It kind of begs the same question about Cantonese. Most people who are fluent in Mandarin don't really understand Cantonese. Um, what complicates things is when we kind of do a synaptic rendering, right? Kind of like looking a view from above. We like to draw maps like this, right? Which shows kind of clear lines. Oh, people over here, they speak that. People down here speak this. It's not really like that. It's a lot more mixed up. In fact, if you look towards the bottom of the map, you see the island of Mindanao. You see these little diamond shapes. It's saying it's only a plurality, meaning that only it doesn't mean majority. It means that the largest group speaks that language. There's actually a whole lot of linguistic diversity. Um, you also see on this map in an area shaded red is a town that I did my PhD research in. Half the place spoke Ilocano, the other half spoke Tagalog. Here on the map, it just shows Tagalog, right? It's finding out what the mother tongue is very difficult. And as we just saw with the previous slide, there's a lot of diversity within this. There's not just one Ilocano and one Cebuano. There's variants of these languages. Now let's kind of look at the urban realities in the Philippines. You go to a place like Manila, you go to the slums. These are people from the countryside who've come from all over, and they bring these 700 languages with them. Um, you know, Tagalog is the primary language in Manila. Um, but it does beg the question. And so, what's the mother tongue of Manila? And should we be providing, dozens of different schools for all these different people? What I saw in practice, the last school I visited in the Philippines was based next to a landfill, and they had child workers in there, people who were working on jeepneys, taking fare, and I saw them teaching math classes in English. That's tough. Maybe it should be in Tagalog. It's difficult to say. Let's also take a look at the role of English in society, and I use here as an example the top newspaper in the Philippines, which is the Philippine Inquirer. And if we look, it's all English. It's all English. That says something. That people think that I think it shows that the thing that English is the language of record. It's the important language. It's more important than Tagalog or the other languages. It's also we're taking a look at code switching. I find this so interesting when I read Filipino newspapers that it's English, 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 and then suddenly you see Tagalog or other languages thrown in, right? It kind of begs the question of why? Is it just to get an accurate quote? Or is it because, as I said, maybe English is the official language of record, but then here you see Tagalog being used, maybe it's a language with more nuance. At least it's thought of as a language with more nuance. What you see in the Philippines, so yeah, you see the code switching where English is used for, local languages are used for quotes in the media, but then, it's also a language that has, in a lot of ways, stopped growing. So, like, if we look at Chinese, they have modern words new words for modern terms, right? So a computer is a dia now, right? But you see in the Philippines, no, it's just a computer, and it's a television, and it's a refrigerator. They haven't invented new Tagalog words for modern terms, right? So you can actually listen to Filipinos, and about like 20% of what they say is going to be in English. So I just kind of throw it out as a discussion question. So what should be the medium of instruction in the Philippines? Tagalog, English, mother tongues, a mix? It begs the question, is Tagalog important, right? English has such currency. You can use it in so many ways that people beg the question of why should it be given a place in schools? I'm not offering answers, but I think the Philippines is an interesting place to see people debating these issues. Let's move over to China, and I'm going to compare two very different places. One Guangzhou, the other one Damba. Damba is a small village I visited in Sichuan. Let's start with Guangzhou. This is what I've seen in Guangzhou. So in Guangzhou, schools teach Putonghua as a medium of instruction, but households still speak Cantonese. Cantonese is very vibrant on the streets. You see lots of Cantonese media. Of course, a lot of this is influenced by Hong Kong, but there's so many. There's Canto Pop, there's Cantonese movies, there's Cantonese books. The language carries a lot of cultural weight. I see local kids speak both fluently, right? Despite Putonghua being used in the classrooms, they're not forgetting Cantonese. I have personally noticed that a lot of migrants pick up Cantonese pretty quickly. That's interesting, right? Let me contrast this now with Damba. So if you look at the map on the left, you'll see on the right of the map there's Chengdu, and then the red area, that's Damba. It's an interesting place. You drive an hour outside of Chengdu, and you are just in a completely different place. It is basically Tibet. Um, this is what it looks like, right? It's very remote. It took us, I think, like 10 hours to drive out here. The roads fall apart every spring because of the melting ice and snow. And if you want to think of it from an education policy point of view, it's really interesting because it shows a window into China's rural education policy. If you just kind of look at the layout of these villages, it would be very costly to build schools and maintain schools in these villages. So they don't. The Chinese have developed a policy where they send basically all primary and secondary students to local schools. Now, I'm saying this is Danba. Danba is actually about an hour away. Danba is where they send the students. Um, we were actually there to build a preschool because you can't send the little kids so far away. So it was there to, offer educational opportunities for them. So when they go to a place like Danba, there's actually a whole lot more immigration. There's a whole lot more Hanzu. There's a lot more Putonghua. It's cheaper for the state to provision the education, but it does have effects. Let's take a look at the literacy in the Danba region. And on the left-hand side, we see a monk, a male monk. Almost nobody in Danba could read Tibetan. Only the monks could. On the right-hand side, we see an older woman. She speaks a local dialect of Tibetan. It seemed like almost every mountain range had its own dialect. She could not speak the same Tibetan as the Dalai Lama. She almost certainly couldn't read. She could speak a little bit of Putonghua, like we could communicate a little bit. Just a little note, the prayer wheel she's holding, her grandfather gave that to her, so it's more than 100 years old. Let's take a look at the children of Danba. On the left-hand side, it's a Hanzu girl. She's playing with Sichuan huajiao, right? Like the spice you get in Sichuan food. She didn't speak Tibetan. She spoke Putonghua. She was only expected to speak Putonghua. She's a new arrival, but those were her expectations. On the right-hand side is a local Tibetan kid. He had cerebral palsy. He had great difficulty moving around. I watched inside of his household. His parents would speak to him in this local Tibetan language, and he would respond back in Putonghua. So he could hear Tibetan. He couldn't speak it, and we could almost be certain he can't read it either. What does this mean long term? It almost certainly means that the language is going to die with him. His children will probably not speak Tibetan, right? I would note here that you see these cases in the news of Tibetans setting themselves on fire. This is that region. This is where it's happening. The Dalai Lama calls this cultural genocide. That might be too strong of a word, but it's happening. There is a significant erosion of the local culture. Let's do a quick recap of Danba. So there's a distinct dialect of Tibetan, a new one every 50 kilometers. You might even say different languages because they might be mutually unintelligible. Older women could speak it, but they could not read it. There was limited Putonghua. Only male monks could read, write, and speak local and Lhasa Tibetan. Local Tibetan kids could hear, but could not speak or read local Tibetan. And the Han migrants could speak and read Putonghua, but very limited, if any, Tibetan. None of the Han migrants are expected to speak Tibetan, but Tibetans are expected to speak Putonghua to the Han. So we'd use here for a class discussion, for Danba and for Guangzhou, why? Why is this happening? Culturally and politically, how did it happen? What role do you think schools play? What should be happening? The point I would take from this is that people in Hong Kong are terrified of the role of Putonghua in schools. Yet Guangzhou actually provides an example of the fact that Cantonese is actually a very powerful language. It has a huge cultural base to it. I forget the exact number, but there's something like 90 million Cantonese speakers in the world. That's a lot, right? Even if it's displaced from schools a little bit, the language will survive. I don't think this local dialect of Tibetan has that same linguistic power. People aren't making, there's no popular music with it. There's no DVDs of movies in it, right? It was already a weak language, and maybe the only place where it could have been reproduced outside of households is in schools. And in schools, it seemed like it's official government policy to keep that language out of the schools, right? So it's just worth reflecting on this, that some languages seem powerful enough to not need schools, but some languages, you probably have to at least teach it as a second or foreign language. They're going to need help. I won't answer what should be happening. I just think these are incredibly complex issues that are worth reflecting.